Ralph Mendonça was not the type of man who lost control of his own hands. He had learned this at the age of 23, when he signed the first contract for Mendonça Investments in a borrowed office from a friend, using a pen that wasn't his, and a suit he had ironed 3 times to make it look new. That day his hands were shaking. After that, never again. In 2 decades of his career, he had weathered storms that brought down companies 3 times the size of his, crises that turned experienced men into shadows of themselves, and negotiations that lasted entire weeks without him yielding a single millimeter. He had learned that control was the only resource money couldn't buy and no one could take away. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in late February, a vehicle ran a red light on Lexington Avenue and took with it everything Ralph had built inside himself during all those years. Leo was 8 years old and was in the back seat with his seatbelt fastened tight, as Ralph always demanded with a firmness that sometimes annoyed his son. He had his sketchbook in his lap and a yellow pencil he had received from his grandmother the previous week, and he was drawing a plane. It was always a plane. The wings always escaped the edges of the page, as if the paper were too small for what he imagined. The impact was side-on the exact side where Leo was sitting. Ralph couldn't clearly remember the following seconds. The noise had been different from what he expected, more dull and final than any sound movies ever showed. He remembered screaming his son's name. He remembered the sirens. He remembered a hospital corridor and a doctor who spoke too slowly, as if the words needed to arrive separately so as not to destroy everything all at once. The diagnosis came in technical language that Ralph memorized without fully understanding. Severe bilateral ocular trauma, retinal detachment in both eyes, irreversible damage to the optic nerve. He asked the doctor to say it simply. The doctor looked at him with that expression of someone who has gone through this hundreds of times and still hasn't discovered a good way to do it. Leo would never see again. For the next 3 days, Ralph had functioned in the automatic mode that business crises had installed in him over the years. He summoned specialists. He sought second and third opinions. He contacted a surgeon in London, a researcher at Johns Hopkins who worked with optic nerve regeneration, and a clinic in Chicago that had published promising results in a study not yet replicated. In less than 3 weeks, he had spent more than many families spend in years on consultations, exams, and experimental protocols. The answer always arrived with the same uncomfortable solidity, varying only in accent and vocabulary. There was no possible reversal for Leo's vision loss. The most urgent problem, however, had ceased to be his vision. 23 days. That was the number Ralph repeated mentally as he had his first breakfast each day, standing before the floor-to-ceiling window of his apartment in the Upper East Side, looking out at the city of New York that continued out there without asking permission. 23 days since Leo had last spoken, since he had responded to his own name, since he had recognized the presence of anyone around him. The doctors called it traumatic dissociation. In words Ralph actually understood. His son had built a glass wall between himself and the world, and no one had yet found where the door was. Sarah had arrived from a small town in Pennsylvania in the 2nd week after the accident. 68 years old, with completely white hair she refused to dye, she had a way of entering rooms that filled the space without needing to make noise. She was the type of woman who had raised her son alone after her husband left the picture too early, who worked for many years as a supermarket cashier so Ralph could study, who had never asked for anything back, and who was now sitting beside her grandson, who didn't recognize her, holding his hand for hours with a patience Ralph deeply admired and could not imitate. He saw his mother there, steady as always, and felt a specific pain of a son who receives more than he deserves and doesn't know how to reciprocate. Not even Sarah had succeeded, nor had Dr. Henry Vance, a child psychiatrist recommended by the director of Mount Sinai Hospital as one of the best in the country, whose sessions cost the equivalent of a monthly salary for many workers, and who produced dense reports with clinical hypotheses that always ended with the same conclusion, disguised as professional caution. It was necessary to wait. Not the speech therapist, nor the occupational therapist, nor the psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, who had come from Boston especially to evaluate the case. 23 days of a boy present in body and completely absent in everything that mattered. Ralph had tried everything reason allowed, and a few things beyond. On a night of insomnia at 3 in the morning, he had called a number an assistant had found on a list of alternative resources. A man who worked with energy therapy and who was recommended by people whose names didn't appear in business magazines. Ralph had listened to the calm voice on the other end for 2 minutes and hung up with the exact mixture of desperation and shame that prevented any comment on the episode. He deleted the number from his contacts as if that would also erase the moment. It didn't. There was also the issue that sat at the back of everything like a second layer of pain, more subtle and therefore more insistent. Leo's mother was not in New York. She hadn't been for 4 years. Rachel had left with a suitcase one day in March, leaving a letter that Ralph had reread too many times. The letter said he could give their son what she couldn't, that he had the resources, the connections, the ability to build a better life for Leo than anything she would be capable of offering alone. Ralph had read that as money, as private school, as travel, as the best specialists when their son needed them. He had spent 4 years convinced he was fulfilling exactly what the letter asked. Now looking at Leo sitting on the living room sofa, with the statue-like immobility that had become the new normal, with his eyes open and fixed on nothing, and his hands still on his thighs, Ralph felt something stir beneath his conviction, a crack appearing in a wall that seemed solid. There was something in Rachel's letter he hadn't read correctly. The resources she mentioned were not the ones he had imagined. On Saturday morning, while Sarah prepared coffee in the kitchen and Leo sat at the table without touching the toast placed in front of him, Ralph had a thought he wouldn't know the origin of if someone asked him to explain. Before everything had shattered, he and his son had a ritual. Every Saturday morning that Ralph could free from his schedule, the two of them would take the car and go to a restaurant in Greenwich Village, a place Ralph had frequented since before he was rich enough to deserve a table without a reservation, a place where the waiter, Charlie, knew Leo wanted orange juice with no sugar and that Ralph took a double espresso without stirring. The boy always asked to see the menu even though he knew by heart what he was going to order because he liked the pictures. It was irrational. Ralph knew this as the thought formed with inconvenient clarity. His son could no longer see, didn't speak, and probably wouldn't recognize the place. But there was something in that thought that wouldn't yield when he tried to discard it, like a door that slams but doesn't lock. Perhaps it was desperation wearing the clothes of intuition when it could no longer find the clothes of strategy. Perhaps it was just the need to do something, anything that wasn't another consultation in a high-end office with no result at the end. He called Sarah from the kitchen. He asked if she would accompany him. She turned from the sink with her hands still wet, looked at her son with those eyes that since he was little seemed to read what he didn't say aloud, and answered yes without asking why. That was the kind of mother she was. Half an hour later, Ralph was driving slowly toward the village with his son in the back seat and Sarah beside him. The May sun came through the side windows with that golden quality that turns the concrete of New York into something almost tolerable. Traffic was lighter than usual for that hour. Leo was motionless, quiet, with his hands on his thighs and his eyes open toward nothing, as always, as it had been every day for the last 23 days. But Ralph, without being able to say where the feeling came from, noticed something different in his son's silence as he drove down Fifth Avenue toward the restaurant. It was as if the day had a texture that the previous ones hadn't had, as if something were about to happen without him knowing the name of it yet. It was probably the illusion of a man tired of waiting. It was probably just that. He didn't know that the name of it was Chloe Vance. He didn't know she had arrived for that shift because a colleague had cancelled at the last minute and that she had said yes because she needed the money and because in some way she also wouldn't be able to explain if someone asked. She always ended up appearing in places where she was needed. The restaurant, the village terrace, sat on one of the quietest corners of the neighborhood, in a 2-story building with ivy covering the facade and wide windows that let the morning light in a way that seemed calculated by someone who understood how brightness changes the perception of things. Ralph had lunched there for the first time when he still didn't have enough money to pay the bill comfortably. He had ordered the cheapest dish on the menu and spent the whole afternoon looking at people who seemed not to need to calculate anything before choosing what to eat. He had promised himself that day that he would return, and he did, and he kept returning until the place became part of the rhythm of his life, as few things managed to be. When Ralph parked the car on the side street and helped Leo out with that care he had learned to have, a different care than before, slower and more attentive to details that previously went unnoticed, the city was making the usual noise of a Saturday in May in New York. Sirens, a conversation coming from a bar across the street, the sound of a street sweeper 2 blocks away. Leo stood still on the sidewalk for a second after getting out of the car, his feet planted on the concrete, his head slightly tilted to the right. Ralph observed this tiny movement with an attention he used to reserve for board meetings. There was something in the way his son tilted his head that seemed different from immobility. It seemed like listening. Sarah got out on the other side and stood beside her grandson without touching him, respecting his space with that instinct grandmothers sometimes develop without needing anyone to teach them. She had learned in recent weeks that Leo withdrew when touched by surprise, as if the unexpected contact were one more piece of information he couldn't process along with all the others the world generated in relentless abundance. They entered. The host recognized them immediately. Ralph was the type of customer good restaurants remember not by name, but by the quality of attention they demand without asking, and in recent years he had become frequent enough that the greeting had the right temperature, neither excessive nor cold. The man looked at Leo with a trained discretion Ralph appreciated, without the expression of exaggerated discomfort many people assumed, and without the exaggeration of sympathy that would be equally bothersome. He simply led the 3 of them to the table by the window facing the inner garden, the table Ralph always preferred and had reserved by phone as he left the house. Charlie arrived 2 minutes later. He was the waiter who had served them for years, a middle-aged man with a soft Brooklyn accent, a well-trimmed mustache, and the kind of gentle efficiency that makes someone feel present without being intrusive. He greeted Ralph with a firm handshake, greeted Sarah with the respectful tilt of the head he reserved for ladies of a certain age, and then leaned slightly toward Leo with a voice that dropped nearly an octave. "Hi, Leo. It's good to see you here again." Leo didn't answer. He was sitting with his hands on the edge of the table, his fingers spread over the white linen tablecloth, exploring the texture in small, repetitive movements that Ralph had recently started to notice. It wasn't total immobility. It was an immobility of the face, the voice, the visible presence, while the hands sometimes moved in those small gestures as if they were still trying to understand the world through an alternative route. Charlie straightened up without comment, and Ralph was grateful for that with a gratitude he didn't verbalize, but that Charlie likely read in his expression. Sarah ordered sparkling water. Ralph ordered the usual double espresso. He also ordered the orange juice with no sugar and placed the glass in front of Leo with that excessive care that had become part of all his gestures in recent weeks, as if he were always one wrong move away from breaking something already fragile. The boy didn't touch the glass. Dr. Henry Vance had arrived before them and was at a nearby table at Ralph's request, to observe the interaction from a distance without being a direct part of the lunch. It was an adjustment the psychiatrist had suggested cautiously, using words like non-clinical familiar environment and organic contextual stimulus. But Ralph had understood it more directly. Perhaps taking Leo out of the offices and putting him in a place the boy knew before the accident could light something that formal sessions weren't managing to reach. The doctor had a notepad on the table next to his coffee and tried to look like an ordinary customer, with a discretion that didn't fool Ralph but probably didn't matter to anyone else in the restaurant. The morning progressed slowly. Ralph ordered the dishes. He ate without tasting. Sarah did what she knew best, which was to be there without turning being there into a performance that applied pressure. She talked in a low voice with Ralph about weightless subjects, the time of her flight back to Pennsylvania on Sunday, a recipe she had found in a magazine, the performance of the sports team Ralph never followed but now pretended to follow slightly to have something to talk about. Leo kept his hands on the edge of the table. He didn't touch the juice. He didn't touch the food Charlie placed in front of him with a veteran's care. He stayed quiet in the specific way that had become impossible to distinguish from absence. Ralph looked at his son for a long moment while Sarah spoke and didn't hear what his mother said. He looked at that face he knew better than any other face, that slightly upturned nose that was identical to the photo of Ralph's mother at age 6, that chin that sometimes tilted up when the boy was concentrated on something he found important. He looked and tried to find his son within that immobility. He had the feeling in those moments of being on the outside of a pane of glass, trying to be seen by someone who doesn't know the glass is there. 14 years earlier, Ralph had been in that same restaurant, not at that table, not with money to pay without calculating, not as the man whose cell phone number was protected by 3 assistants before it was reached. He had been there alone late one afternoon, with an idea everyone around him said had no future, with his account in the red and a proposal that had been rejected for the 3rd time in the same week. He had ordered only a coffee because it was all he could pay for, without compromising the bus fare home. He was on the verge of calling his old boss and asking for the job back that he had left 6 months earlier, which was a defeat he would feel for the rest of his life, but seemed to be the only real way out. And then a staff member had brought the coffee. A middle-aged woman, impeccable apron, black hair tied back. She had placed the cup with that invisible competence of professionals who do everything right without seeming to make an effort. And then, without Ralph having said anything, without there being any visible sign that he was collapsing inside, she had looked at him with a calm smile and said, "You look like someone who's going to go far." And she walked away. Ralph had sat looking at the cup of coffee for a good minute. There was nothing extraordinary about the sentence. It wasn't profound wisdom. It didn't solve the problem of the rejected proposal or the red account. But there was something in the way it had been said, without expecting an answer, without wanting anything in return, that had landed on him in a way that never let go. He had paid for the coffee, left a tip disproportionate to what he could afford at that moment, and left the restaurant with something different than what he had entered with. Not hope, exactly. Something firmer than hope. Conviction. He had never gone back to thank her. He had never found that woman on the subsequent times he returned to the restaurant. He had asked about her once, years later, when he was already the kind of customer who could ask, and learned she had left many years ago. He didn't know her name. He had no way to find her. He carried that as one of the few debts of his life he knew he could never pay. Charlie reappeared to check the dishes and asked discreetly if everything was okay. Ralph said yes with that tone that ends conversations, and it was then that Charlie informed them, with the natural tone of someone passing on routine information, that he would need to step away for about 20 minutes to resolve a problem in the kitchen during the shift change, and that another employee would come to serve them during that period. Ralph nodded without taking his eyes off his son. He didn't pay attention when the young woman entered from the side of the room carrying an order pad. He didn't notice the apron with the dark sauce stain she had tried to clean with a damp napkin without success. He didn't notice the hair tied in a hurried bun from which strands escaped on all sides, nor the way she moved between the tables with the efficiency of someone who is tired, but has learned not to let exhaustion show in her walk. She was the type of presence that environment had been designed to make invisible, and Ralph, at that moment, did exactly what the environment expected of him. But it wasn't Ralph she looked at when she reached the table. It was Leo. Chloe Vance had the habit of looking at people with an attention that sometimes bothered those not accustomed to being truly seen. It wasn't an analytical look. It wasn't the kind of evaluative look people use to decide what to think of someone before a conversation begins. It was something else, closer to the sincere curiosity of someone who finds something familiar in something that seems strange, and stands still for a second, trying to understand where the two touch. Most people went through their whole lives without developing that look. Chloe had developed it at 6 years old, in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, alongside a brother who needed someone to see him with precision, because he himself was ceasing to see. When she approached the Mendonça table, still carrying the order pad and with the apron that insisted on evidencing her last-minute haste, she noticed the boy before she noticed the father. She noticed in the way one notices something memory recognizes before reason organizes it. The open eyes without focus, the position of the shoulders slightly turned inward, like someone who had created a private space within the larger space. The hands on the edge of the table exploring the tablecloth in small repetitive movements. There was a quality in that ensemble that she knew from a very specific place inside herself, and it made the next step different from what it would have been otherwise. She greeted the couple with the usual protocol, quick and functional. The gentleman in the dark suit who didn't even lift his eyes from his son. The older lady with white hair who responded with genuine cordiality. She asked if they needed anything else. She noted the order for a second coffee, and then she stood still a second longer than protocol dictated, looking at the 8-year-old boy sitting between the two adults like someone who was entirely elsewhere. Ralph lifted his eyes to her with that expression of someone about to politely dismiss a presence that had become inconvenient. Chloe didn't wait for the dismissal. She knelt down. Not abruptly, not performatively. She knelt with the naturalness of someone who does it so many times that the movement has lost any artificiality. She descended to the boy's height with the pad still in hand and stood looking at him from the side, without invading, without forcing the field of vision of someone who couldn't see anyway, but making herself present in the space in a way that sound and smell and human warmth could reach. "Hi," she said. Low voice without the sappy exaggeration adults use with children when they are embarrassed. "My name is Chloe. Can I tell you what's here on the table?" Ralph opened his mouth. Sarah held her breath without realizing it. Dr. Vance, 3 tables away, lifted his pen from the pad. Leo didn't answer, but he didn't pull back either. Chloe took that as enough of an answer. She reached out her hand slowly, with that precision of someone who knows exactly what she is doing, and placed her own fingers lightly under the boy's right hand. She didn't grab. She didn't pull. She simply placed her hand underneath like a scaffold, like a surface that exists to support and not to restrict, and stayed still like that for a second, letting Leo feel the contact and decide what to do with it. Ralph held his own breath. Leo didn't pull his hand away. Chloe began to guide the boy's fingers with slow movements toward the edge of the plate on the table, still with food on it, and began to speak. Not in the tone of someone explaining to a child who doesn't understand, in the tone of someone telling something they find genuinely interesting and want to share. Right here on the side is the sourdough bread. This one they make here is different from others because the crust is thicker, you know. You can feel the difference just by touching it. The flour they use is a darker grain, and when it comes out of the oven, it has that shell that makes a noise when you squeeze it. She guided Leo's fingers to the edge of the bread. She let the tips of the boy's fingers touch the surface of the crust. Ralph felt his stomach tighten in a way he hadn't felt in weeks, not from anxiety, from something else he wouldn't know how to name at the time if he tried. Chloe continued, with that low voice that didn't disturb the silence, but existed within it. "Here in the center of the plate is the chicken, still hot. You can feel the steam if you put your hand a little above it without touching. The sauce is a little to the side in a small dish. It's round, the edge is raised, you can feel it." She kept guiding. Not with haste, not with the anxiety of someone who wants the technique to work. With that patience that is not an absence of urgency, but rather the conviction that time spent the right way is not time wasted. The restaurant around them continued at its rhythm. Waiters circulated. Conversations happened at nearby tables. Someone asked for the check. But there was something in the little bubble of that table that was different from the rest of the room, and some of the people closest began to notice without knowing what they were noticing, averting their eyes for a second, and then returning to their own conversations with that feeling of having seen something they didn't know how to classify. Sarah had her hands joined on the table. Ralph realized his mother's eyes were wet before he realized his were too. He turned his gaze to the window with that specific movement men who learn to bury emotion use when it appears without warning in public places. The window looked out onto the restaurant's inner garden, where there was an ivy with small purple flowers he had never noticed the previous times he had looked at that garden. Dr. Vance was motionless 3 tables away with his pen suspended over the pad. Leo still hadn't spoken, but the fingers Chloe had guided over the bread and the chicken and the edge of the sauce dish hadn't pulled back. They stayed where she had left them, on the slightly rough surface of the linen tablecloth, with his fingers lightly spread like someone testing the weight of something before deciding whether to trust it. Chloe stayed in the kneeling position, giving no sign she was going to get up. Ralph noticed her legs were bent in a way that must have hurt after a few minutes, but she showed no sign of discomfort. There was something in that position he suddenly saw clearly. She had made herself smaller, not to be less, but to be reachable. It was different from what the specialists did when they leaned down to talk to Leo, which was always a calculated gesture that carried the shadow of technique. Chloe had knelt like someone who simply goes to where the person is, because that is where the conversation needs to happen. "Did you used to come here before?" she asked, with the same tone of someone telling something interesting, without the burden of someone waiting for an answer as proof they are making progress. The silence that followed was familiar. It was the silence of 23 days. But there was something in it that was different. Ralph noticed it and couldn't say what it was. It was like the difference between the silence of an empty room and the silence of a room with someone inside who hasn't yet decided to speak. Chloe didn't fill the silence with more words. She stayed where she was, with her hand still under Leo's very lightly, without pressing, and waited with the patience of someone who knows some things don't arrive faster when you insist they arrive. She looked at the garden beside them, as if she were genuinely interested in the ivy out there, and waited. Ralph was looking at the two of them with that tense attention of someone who has seen something they don't understand, but knows is important and is afraid of making the wrong move that will end it. The grandmother was quiet, with her hands joined. The doctor had finally put down his pen completely still. No one was breathing deep enough. And then, very slowly, Leo turned his head, not toward his father, not toward his grandmother. He turned his head toward Chloe with that slight upward tilt people use when they try to locate a sound or a presence they can't see but felt was there, like someone tracking the origin of something that arrived first through touch and smell before anything else. That turn of the head lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was the first time in 23 days that Leo Mendonça had turned his head toward anything. Ralph had to turn his gaze back to the window. He didn't make it fast enough. Chloe Vance had learned very early in life that silence is not the same as absence. She had learned this in the way one learns the things that stay, which is through the repeated experience of a truth until it ceases to be knowledge and becomes part of the body. Her brother Lucas was 5 years old when the first signs appeared. A vision problem that the doctors in their small town in Pennsylvania took a long time to diagnose correctly. The process was slow, like a light fading without anyone noticing the exact moment the room became darker. Between Lucas's ages of 5 and 12, his vision decreased by degrees, and Chloe followed every one of them. What she had learned in that accompaniment was a way of being present that didn't depend on speech as the primary channel. She had learned that touch said things that words took too long to reach, that the smell of something familiar could open a door a long explanation couldn't. That a person who has lost one sense has not lost the need to understand the world. They have only changed the instruments they use for it, and the task of those on the outside is to learn to speak in that other language, instead of insisting on the one the other person no longer accesses in the same way. None of this had she formulated quite like that when she was beside Leo that morning. She was just doing what she knew how to do. In the same way a musician doesn't think about the chords when they are playing, they just play. Leo's head had turned toward her. He stayed with his head at that angle, like a physical question mark, and Chloe responded to that without turning it into a big deal. She simply continued. "This bread here has a shell they call crunchy," she said with the same tone as before, low and genuine. "Do you know what crunchy is?" Nothing. But Leo's head hadn't returned to its previous position. It stayed tilted toward the voice. Chloe continued, choosing her words with the care of someone fishing in shallow water, who knows any wrong move scares away what was arriving. Crunchy is a texture that has sound. It's different from soft, which is silent. When you bite something crunchy, it makes a little noise you can even feel in your teeth. She took a small piece of the edge of the bread, the smallest one on the edge of the plate, and placed it in the palm of her hand, which she extended toward the boy. "Do you want to feel it?" The silence lasted the equivalent of one long breath. Ralph had his elbows on the table and his hands interlaced in front of his face in a gesture he probably hadn't realized he had made. Sarah's eyes were as wide as they could fit on her face. Dr. Vance had lifted half an inch from his chair without noticing. Leo's hand moved, slowly, with that hesitation of someone making a decision that isn't small. The boy's hand left the edge of the table and reached toward the voice. His fingers touched Chloe's palm, felt the piece of bread, squeezed it lightly. The crust made a minimal sound, almost inaudible amidst the restaurant noise, but in those 4 square yards of space, it sounded like something much larger. The boy made the gesture again. He squeezed the piece of bread a second time, then a third, as if testing the consistency of what he had discovered. Crunchy, said Chloe, with the naturalness of someone confirming something the other person already knows but hasn't yet formulated into a word. And then the thing happened that no one at the table had managed to provoke in 23 days. Leo opened his mouth. The voice that came out was hoarse, as happens with someone who has gone too long without using their vocal cords, a bit raspy at the edges, a bit hesitant like an instrument that has been stored away and needs a few notes to find its tuning. And what came out was a question. Only 4 words, but they arrived at the table as if they were made of a different substance than words normally are. What is crunchy? Ralph closed his eyes. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, and the movement was so fast she knocked over her napkin without realizing it. Dr. Vance crumpled the page of his notepad with a closed fist without realizing he had done it. Chloe didn't change her expression. She didn't do anything that might signal to the boy that the question was extraordinary, that the question had shattered the silence of 23 days, as one shatters something with a precise blow in the right place. She answered with the same voice as before, like someone continuing a conversation that was already rolling. Crunchy is like the sound of stepping on a dry leaf in the fall. You know when the leaves fall from the trees and stay on the ground until they get real dry? When you step on them, they make a noise. Crunch. That's crunchy. The boy was quiet for a moment, processing. Chloe could recognize that type of silence which wasn't the silence of someone who had closed a door, but the silence of someone in internal motion. I never stepped on a dry leaf, Leo said. His voice was already a little less hoarse, as if remembering how to function. You will, Chloe said, with the quiet firmness of someone stating what they consider a fact. Next fall, if you want. There's a park near here that gets full of oak leaves on the ground in the fall. It's one of the best things in the world, stepping on dry leaves. Have you stepped on them? I've stepped on them so much I've lost count. Leo was quiet again, but it was a different silence from all those that had preceded it. It was the silence of someone thinking, not of someone who was gone. Chloe felt that difference in the fingers that still lightly touched the boy's hand. There was a different tension there, the tension of attention instead of the tension of absence. And the mashed potatoes? Leo asked after a few seconds. Ralph opened his eyes. Chloe answered without hesitating. The mashed potatoes are the opposite of crunchy. They're soft, they're silent, they're the kind of thing you eat and the noise disappears, understand? These here are made with butter and a bit of cream, so they have a flavor that stays on your tongue after you've swallowed, which is different from the flavor while you're eating. What do you mean, stays after? There are things that end when they're finished, and there are things that continue a little bit after they end. The mashed potatoes are like that. The flavor continues for a while, like an echo. There was a pause, and then Leo said, with that voice that was tuning itself as he spoke, "Echo, I know what that is. Dad explained it to me once. It's when the sound goes and comes back." Ralph felt something move inside his chest, with a gentle violence he didn't know was possible. That had been an afternoon in the Poconos 2 years ago, when he could still see, when they shouted into the valleys and stayed listening to the voice coming back from afar. The boy had shouted his own name, and stayed waiting to hear it back with absolute seriousness, as if checking if he was real. Chloe nodded her head, even knowing the boy couldn't see the gesture, by that habit of someone accustomed to confirming with their whole body, and not just with words. Exactly. It's when the sound goes and comes back. The flavor of the potatoes is an echo of the flavor. That's strange, Leo said. It's strange and it's good. Sometimes the strange things are the best ones. There was a longer pause this time. Chloe didn't fill it. She stayed where she was with that body position that said, "I am here," without saying, "I am leaving if you don't talk." The restaurant around them continued at its own pace. Ralph hadn't managed to eat anything else since the moment Leo had turned his head. He was just looking at his son with that attention of someone seeing something they didn't believe they would see again. "Do you work here?" Leo asked. "Today, yes. Do you work in other places too?" "Sometimes I go where I'm needed." The boy processed that. "And when you're not needed anywhere?" Chloe laughed. It was a small and genuine laugh, without the exaggeration of someone who finds a child's joke funny. "That doesn't happen much. There's always someone needing something somewhere. But when there isn't, I stay quiet and listen to the noises." "What noises?" The noises you don't hear when you're too busy. The sound of the wind in the window. The sound of the rain on the asphalt, which is different from the sound of the rain on the grass. The sound of people walking in the hallway of my building. There's a person on my floor who wears a shoe that makes a different sound from the other, because the right heel is worn down. Leo was quiet for a second. You hear all that? When I pay attention, yes, everyone hears it, but most people don't pay attention. I started hearing more, the boy said with a seriousness that was older than 8 years. Since I stopped seeing, I stay listening to things. I know, Chloe said softly. And what did you hear today that you found interesting? There was a pause. And then, with that voice still hoarse but now firmer, more present, more clearly the voice of a boy who was back, Leo answered, You talk in a different way than other people. Ralph turning his gaze away was impossible this time. There was a certain quality to the emotion Ralph Mendonça had learned to recognize over the years as particularly dangerous. It wasn't the emotion that arrived with warnings, with the pressure in the throat that precedes tears, or with the urge to pace that precedes anguish. It was the emotion that arrived from below, silent as water rising through a wall with small cracks, and that only announced itself when it was already above the line that could be controlled. In board meetings, he had learned to combat it with technical coldness, with concentration on numbers, with the professional distance that separates what a person feels from what a person shows. But he hadn't trained for this. There was no protocol for the moment when his 8-year-old son, who had spent 23 days completely closed off from the world, looked in the direction of a young waitress and said she talked in a different way than other people. Ralph stayed with his eyes averted to the window. For a time he didn't know how to measure. The inner garden had an ivy with tiny purple flowers he had noticed before, and now he saw without seeing, using the image as an anchor, while he processed what was happening 6 feet away. When he managed to turn back, Chloe was still in the same position beside Leo, with that composure that wasn't indifference, but rather the absence of anxiety that makes a presence safe for someone learning to trust again. Sarah had taken an invisible step beyond containment. Both hands covered her mouth, and she shook her head from side to side in slow movements, that universal gesture of someone facing something that exceeds the available vocabulary to describe it. Ralph had seen his mother cry few times in his life. She was made of the same material as him in that aspect, and when her eyes became shiny, the only thing he could do was look back at the window for a few more seconds. 3 tables away, Dr. Henry Vance had closed his notepad and had his hands on the table, palms down like someone who needs to feel a solid surface. He was a man accustomed to dealing with difficult cases, with situations where progress was measured in millimeters over months, with parents who came to sessions full of expectation and left with the same burden they had brought. He hadn't seen in 20 years of clinical practice a child in traumatic dissociation come out of that state in the way he was seeing now. In a restaurant, beside a waitress who had arrived in a stained apron and disheveled hair and had done in less than 15 minutes what none of the hired specialists had managed in 23 days. There was a part of the doctor that had enough wisdom to know that this observation didn't need to diminish what the specialists had tried. There was another part, smaller and more honest, that was simply stunned. Chloe had responded to what Leo said without turning it into a prize. I talk in a different way because I learned to describe things for someone who needed me to describe them well. Who? My brother. His name is Lucas. When we were little, he started losing his vision little by little. We lived in a tiny town in Pennsylvania, and I learned to be his eyes for the things he couldn't see anymore. The boy was processing that. Chloe could feel the processing by the way Leo's hand moved slightly under hers, like small waves on the surface of something deep. Losing it how? Leo asked, with that child's seriousness that hasn't yet learned that some subjects should be avoided. Like a light that goes getting lower, first he stopped seeing well from far away, then from close up. Then it got hard in the dark. It was slow. It was a long time. And did he get scared? Chloe thought for a second. Not the second of someone improvising an answer, but the second of someone who wants to give the true answer. Yes, in the beginning, yes. But he had me. What did you do? I described. I told him what the color of the sky was at the end of the afternoon because he said he remembered the orange and wanted to know if it was still there. I took his hand to the fruit in the market before we bought it, so he could feel the texture, so he could choose. I invented ways to tell him what the things were like that he wasn't going to see anymore, but in a way that stayed stored in him in another way. How did you invent them? In the same way I just did with you, using the other things. Sound, texture, smell, temperature. The world doesn't end when vision decreases, it changes language, and the people on the outside need to learn to speak in that other language. Leo was very quiet. It was a different silence from all the previous ones, different from the silence of absence that had dominated the last weeks. It was the silence of someone digesting something important, putting something new in the place of something that had fallen. "Did he stay with you?" Leo asked after a moment. "Lucas?" "He did. He's an adult now, lives on his own in Philadelphia, works with computers. He calls me every Sunday. Last week he called me to tell me he had discovered a new app that reads text aloud, and that now he can read the newspaper without needing anyone." "Is he happy?" Chloe answered without hesitating. "He's one of the happiest guys I know." There was something in that answer that changed the temperature of the air around the table. Not dramatically, not in the way movie twists change scenes, but in a real, measurable way, the temperature changed. Ralph felt it in his chest before he could articulate the reasons. It was as if a question his son had been asking without words for the last weeks had received an answer, coming from a direction no one had predicted, from a person who wasn't in the treatment protocol, who hadn't been summoned for that role, who had arrived for the shift because a colleague had cancelled at the last minute. Sarah had gotten up discreetly and headed toward the restroom. Ralph saw her pass and realized his mother needed a minute alone with her own relief. There were things Sarah wasn't going to do in front of him, and crying for real was one of them. Leo had relaxed in his chair. It was a subtle movement, but one Ralph recognized in the way one recognizes something that was absent for so long that one forgets what it was like to have it. The boy had spent weeks with that closed posture, shoulders slightly turned inward, head down or tilted at some angle that seemed to seek something it didn't find. Now he was leaning against the back of the chair with that specific lightness of someone who has landed on a surface after being suspended for a long time. "You're also going to be happy," Chloe said, with that tone that didn't promise what it couldn't guarantee, but affirmed what it believed with a conviction that arrived before any argument. Leo didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Do you know that? I don't know everything. But I know you ask good questions, and people who ask good questions generally find good answers." "What kind of question is good?" Chloe considered. "The ones you asked today. You asked what crunchy is. You asked about Lucas. You asked if he got scared. Those are questions that want to understand for real, not just questions that want to fill silence. There's a difference." Leo was quiet with that. Then, with that voice that had come out hoarse and was now a bit firmer, like a muscle returning to use after forced rest, he said, "Does Dad ask good questions?" Ralph realized he had held his breath the moment his son said, "Dad." It was the first time in 23 days that Leo had said the word Dad. Chloe turned slightly in the direction where Ralph was sitting, with that gesture of someone including someone in a conversation without making it a sharp movement. Ralph felt her gaze land on him for a second, a fraction of evaluation and a fraction of encouragement mixed together. "I don't know," Chloe said honestly. "You have to ask him." There was a pause. And then Leo turned his head in the direction of where his father's voice was, with that tracking movement he had learned to use in the last few days, and said, in a tone in which there was something of a question and something of a statement at the same time, "Dad." Ralph answered with the voice he still managed to assemble, "I'm here." "Do you ask good questions?" There was a question beneath the question, and Ralph felt both at the same time as if they were layers of something being slowly unfolded. The top question was about questions. The bottom question was about whether his father was the type of person who cared for real about the answers. It took him a second to answer, but he answered with the voice of someone trying to be true, even when the truth isn't easy. "I'm learning." Leo considered that. Then he turned his head back toward Chloe. "He said he's learning." "That's a good answer," Chloe said. And Ralph, for the first time in weeks, felt he had done something right. The conversation between Leo and Chloe lasted another 40 minutes. Ralph knew the exact time because he looked at his watch once and then didn't look again, and when he looked back, all that time had passed. In the middle of it, Charlie had returned from his break, seen the scene, and silently retreated to the edge of the room without interrupting. Sarah had returned from the restroom with her eyes slightly redder than when she went, drank a sip of water, and reassumed her place at the table with that discreet competence of a grandmother who knows her role at that moment is to be background and not the figure. Over the 40 minutes, Leo had asked more questions than Ralph could count. About the smell of rain, which Chloe had explained with a precision that involved the word petrichor, which the boy asked her to repeat 3 times because he thought the sound was beautiful. About the difference in temperature between marble and wood when you touch both. About why bread cools faster than mashed potatoes. About the specific noise of the restaurant at that hour, which Chloe had decomposed into layers, like someone taking apart a watch to show what makes time work. The voices, the silverware, the air conditioning ventilation, the footsteps in different types of soles, the glass door that closes with a different sound than the wooden door. Leo had eaten. That detail by itself had made Sarah squeeze Ralph's hand under the table with a strength that would probably leave a mark. The boy had eaten the bread, had asked Chloe to guide the spoon to the mashed potatoes, and then had held the spoon alone. He had drunk the orange juice that had sat untouched for hours. He had asked to feel the orange peel that garnished the rim of the glass. He had asked if oranges and lemons were from the same family, and when Chloe said yes, he had stayed quiet for a moment, and then said he thought it was curious that things from the same family could have such different flavors. There was, in that observation, the boy Ralph knew, the one who asked too many questions and made observations that were older than the age he had. When the plates were cleared and the final coffee was served, when the restaurant had emptied into the calm that follows the lunch peak, Ralph realized Chloe had stayed there much longer than the coverage shift required. She had served other tables between the moments with Leo, had fulfilled her duties with that quiet efficiency that seemed not to need attention to function, but she had always returned to near that table when she finished, and Leo had always tilted his head slightly in her direction when she came near, like someone training their ear for a specific sound they learned to recognize. Ralph asked for the check, and then, while Charlie prepared the payment machine, he did something he hadn't planned, but that came out with the naturalness of a decision made some time before without him knowing. He called Chloe by the name he had read on her name tag when she had knelt for the first time. Chloe. She approached the table with that direct step of someone who doesn't stall. Yes? I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes, if possible, not as customer to server, as person to person. He paused. Could you sit down? Chloe looked briefly at the room, verified the other tables were stable, and then pulled out the chair that had remained empty since the start of lunch, and sat with that direct way there was in everything she did. Sarah had taken Leo to see the inner garden, guiding her grandson's hand by his arm with care, and the two were a few yards away near the glass door that led to the outdoor space. Ralph looked at the young woman in front of him for a second before speaking. It was the type of pause he used in negotiations, but here it had a different function. He was looking at her, trying to understand what he saw. 26 years old, maybe, no more than that. Hair that had completely given up on the original bun and now fell partially over her neck. Apron with the stain she had tried to clean. Dark eyes that looked back at him without any of the forms of intimidation most people felt in Ralph Mendonca's presence. How did you know what to do? He asked. She didn't pretend not to understand. I didn't know. I did what I know how to do. Tell me about that. Chloe crossed her arms on the table in a gesture that wasn't closed but was concentrated, like someone preparing to tell something they've told many times but still tell with care. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. My younger brother, Lucas, was born with a condition in his eyes that progressed slowly. We didn't have money for the treatments that might have slowed the process, so the alternative was to learn to live the way things were. Since I was 6, I went along learning to be what he needed me to be. Not his eyes, not in that way that makes it seem like the person loses their autonomy, but the bridge, the channel between the world he couldn't see the way he saw before, and the world that was on the outside. Ralph listened without interrupting. I learned that when you take away vision, you don't take away the need to understand space. The person still needs to know where things are, what they're like, what they mean. It's just that the path changes. And if the people around insist on using the old path which doesn't exist anymore, the communication breaks. The boy isn't broken. She said this directly without softening it. He's on the other side of a wall that got too thick, and he needed someone to knock on that wall the right way. Not with force, with frequency, with patience, with the willingness to lower yourself to where he is, instead of staying waiting for him to climb up to where everyone else is. Ralph stayed with that for a moment. There was a clarity in that formulation that hit him in a way Dr. Vance's reports, with all the technical vocabulary and all the expertise, hadn't managed. It was the difference between someone who learned something in books and someone who learned something with their body. And your brother today? He works as a programmer in Philadelphia. He's independent, has his own life, he calls every Sunday. Chloe said this with that specific pride of an older sister that doesn't need adjectives to be evident. What does he do on the Sundays when he calls? She gave a small smile, the first Ralph had seen on her since they started talking face to face. Tells me how his week was, complains about Philly traffic, asks me if I've eaten right. Last week, he spent 15 minutes explaining a new series he discovered on a streaming platform, describing the scenes in detail as if I were the one who hadn't seen it. Ralph smiled. It was involuntary, and he didn't try to hold it. He sounds well. It's what I told Leo. He's one of the happiest guys I know. She paused. But it took time, and it took the right people on the right path. Are you finishing your degree in speech-language pathology? Ralph had heard Charlie mention something tangentially in a previous comment. Chloe's expression changed slightly. It didn't close, but it became more careful. I was. I had to stop for a while for lack of resources. I'm saving money to resume. I'm not far from finishing the last stage. Why speech pathology? Because of Lucas, and because I realized that what I did with him instinctively has a scientific basis, has technique, has depth. I wanted to learn to do better than I do. I wanted to have the right instruments to help more people like him, like Leo. Ralph stayed looking at her for a second longer than the protocol of conversation determined. He was thinking. It was the type of thought that in his negotiations preceded a big decision, but now it had a completely different texture from negotiations. It was more personal, more urgent. Do you have family in New York? He asked, still without revealing where he was going. Just me. I moved here 2 years ago. Before I was in Philly near Lucas, but he's independent and doesn't need my constant presence anymore, so I came to try life here. The cost of living is higher, but the opportunity is too. A small pause. At least that's what they say. And your mother? Ralph asked, in a tone that didn't reveal why he was asking, because he himself wouldn't know how to explain why at that moment. There was something in the young woman in front of him that made this question appear almost instinctively, the same way one asks about something that seems incomplete without that information. Chloe's face took on an expression that wasn't exactly sadness, but it was something in the neighborhood of sadness, something that had passed from acute pain to permanent longing. My mother worked her whole life. She was a very hard-working woman. She passed away 2 years ago. I miss her every day. Ralph nodded slowly. Did she live in Pennsylvania? No. She lived in New York for many years. She worked here for a good part of her life. She loved telling stories about the people who passed through her work. Chloe said this with that specific smile of someone holding a memory that warms. She had an incredible memory for faces. She said every person who passed in front of her carried a story, and that you could see part of that story if you paid attention to the way they looked. Ralph stayed motionless. What did she do in New York? He asked. And there was something in the way he asked that was different from the previous questions. Quieter, like someone who fears and needs at the same time. In restaurants, Chloe said, not knowing what that answer was doing to the person in front of her. She worked in several places over the years. She was a waitress. She loved the work. She said serving well was a way of caring. Ralph stayed looking at her. There was something moving inside him with that slow speed of a thing still taking shape, not yet reached its final outline, but already recognizable enough to make his chest tighten in a specific way. What was your mother's name? He asked, and Chloe answered. The name arrived as things that change everything arrive, without warning, without ceremony, with the disturbing naturalness of a piece finding its fit after being lost for too long. Chloe said her mother's name with that smile of someone holding a memory that warms, with the lightness of someone who doesn't know that the words she is pronouncing are completely dismantling something in the person in front of her. Martha Vance. Ralph stayed motionless. It wasn't the type of immobility that precedes a quick reaction. It was the immobility of someone who received information that the entire system needed a few seconds to process, because the information was too big to fit in the available space without everything else yielding a little to make room. He stayed with his eyes on Chloe, but looking from the inside out, like someone checking something very distant. "Martha Vance," he repeated. His voice came out lower than it had gone in. Chloe frowned slightly. There was something in the expression of the man in front of her that changed in a way she couldn't explain. "Yes. Why?" Ralph stayed in silence for another second. Then, with that care of someone going slowly, because they are afraid the thing will break if they go fast, he asked, "Did she work here in this restaurant?" Chloe's frown deepened as understanding tried to form. "Yes, for several years, before returning to Pennsylvania." A pause. "How do you know that?" Ralph didn't answer immediately. He was looking at her with that expression she couldn't catalogue, which was simultaneously recognition and incredulity, and something that looked very much like gratitude dammed up for a long time. He opened his mouth once and closed it, opened it again. 14 years ago, he began with the voice of someone choosing each word like choosing where to place their foot on terrain they don't know. "I was in this restaurant. I didn't have the company yet. I was at rock bottom in a way I've never truly told anyone. I had ordered the cheapest coffee I could pay for because it was what fit what I had. I was on the verge of giving up on an idea that everyone around me said had no future." He paused, and a waitress brought the coffee and said, without me having asked for anything, and without her staying waiting for an answer, "You look like someone who is going to go far." The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had existed that day. Chloe had her hand flat on the table. Her eyes had become wider, and there was in them that specific quality of the eyes of someone seeing two things at the same time, the present and a past that suddenly became much closer than it was. "You never found her afterward," Chloe said. It wasn't a question. Never. I asked about her once, years later. I learned she had left. I didn't know her name. I had no way to find her. A pause. And I never forgot that sentence. Never. In 20 years of business, in every difficult decision, in every meeting where things seemed to be falling apart, that sentence always came back. It's the type of thing that doesn't make sense to have so much weight. It was a simple sentence from a person I never saw again, but it stayed. Chloe was looking at him with eyes that now had that brightness she had tried to contain, but was clearly losing the battle. Her hand on the table was slightly closed, not in tension, but like someone holding something they don't want to let fall. "She loved telling stories about the people who passed through her work," Chloe said, with a voice that was a little lower than before. "When I was little, when we were still in Pennsylvania and she called on the weekends, she always had a story. A man who had arrived looking like he had the world on his shoulders and left with a different step. A woman who had cried quietly at the back table, and she had brought a little plate of dessert for free because it seemed like it would help." A pause. "She said those stories were the best part of the work, the people who passed in front of her, and in whom she could plant a small thing." Ralph closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was something different in his expression. The calculated hardness that was always there, which had been built over years of difficult decisions made in cold rooms, had yielded in a way he probably didn't realize. His face was simpler, more honest. "I could never say thank you," he said. "She knew," Chloe said with a gentle certainty. "She didn't do it to receive thanks. She did it because she believed the right words at the right time change something, that it's the responsibility of someone who sees a human being with potential to say it out loud, especially when that person isn't managing to see themselves." Ralph stayed with that, and then he said, with a voice that was clearly making an effort to stay firm, "You are very much like her, in the way you do things." Chloe smiled. It was a different smile from the previous ones, deeper, more loaded. "People who know me say that. I always think it's too big a compliment for me." "It's not too big. They stayed in silence for a moment. It was a full silence, the type that doesn't need to be filled because it already has what it needs to have. Outside, through the glass of the door leading to the garden, Sarah was with Leo, guiding her grandson's hand through the texture of the purple-flowered ivy with that patience of a grandmother who had learned the lesson the specialists couldn't teach on a Saturday afternoon in Greenwich Village. Ralph looked at the two of them and felt that specific mixture of things that don't have a single name. His son had spoken, his son had eaten, his son had said, "Dad," and had asked to hold the young woman's hand when she guided his fingers through the garden out there. 23 days of silence had yielded before a presence that used no technique, that had knelt down and stayed and talked like someone talking to someone who is truly there. And that presence was the daughter of a woman who had said 9 words to a desperate man 14 years ago. 9 words that had changed the course of a company, of a life, and that now, by a sequence of events no strategy could have planned, had reached that man's son through that woman's daughter. There was a word for that, but Ralph wasn't the type of man who used it often. He was learning to use it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can. Would you stay a bit longer? While we leave, I want Leo to say goodbye to you." Chloe nodded without hesitating. Ralph went to the glass door and called his son by name. Leo turned his head in the direction of his father's voice with that tracking movement he had learned to use. Sarah looked at her son with an expression that said everything she had chosen not to say aloud during that entire Saturday. Ralph opened the door and said, with a voice that was softer than the voice he used in most contexts of his life, "Chloe is going to say goodbye to you." Leo turned his head in the other direction, seeking Chloe's location by the right angle. She had gotten up from the chair and was a few yards ahead, and when Leo located her by the sound of her footsteps, he reached out his hand first. Not to Chloe, to his father. Ralph stayed motionless for half a second, and then, with a care that was the type of care one doesn't learn in a boardroom, he took his son's small hand. Leo squeezed it. He didn't let go. Thus the two stayed, father and son with hands interlaced, while Chloe knelt for the last time that day and told the boy it had been very good to meet him and that she remembered what she had promised about the dry oak leaves in the park nearby. Leo said he hadn't forgotten. He said he wanted to go back. He said, with that 8-year-old seriousness that was older than the age that fit in him, "Will you be here?" Chloe looked at Ralph for an instant. He looked back. "I think so," she said, and Leo, who had arrived at that restaurant 23 days after the worst day of his life, completely closed off from the world, left there with his father's hand in his right and the promise of a voice he had learned to recognize, echoing behind him like something stored for when he needed it. Outside, the May sun still had that golden quality. On the sidewalk, as Ralph opened the car, Sarah looked at the restaurant facade and made a small gesture with her head. The type of gesture people make when they are thanking something that doesn't have a fixed address but seems to need a destination. The way back to the Upper East Side was silent in a way Ralph had never experienced before. There was the silence that comes from emptiness, which is the silence of the last 23 days in the apartment, heavy as something accumulated. And there was the silence that comes from fullness, which is the silence of when something too big has happened to fit into immediate conversation and people need space to let it settle. That Saturday had produced the second type. Sarah looked out the passenger window with that expression of someone inside a long thought, and with no intention of shortening it. Leo was in the back seat with his head leaning against the glass, not in that empty way from before, but with that slightly attentive tilt of someone listening to the sound of traffic, separating each layer, learning the new language of the world that presented itself through the other senses. Ralph noticed this through the rearview mirror. Noticed the way his son's fingers sometimes moved slightly over the fabric of the seat, like small waves, and had to force his eyes back to the road more than once. When they reached the apartment and Sarah took Leo to his room for his afternoon rest, Ralph stayed alone in the living room for a few minutes. He didn't turn on his cell phone, which had stayed in his pocket during the whole morning, in a feat of self-discipline he had never achieved in any meeting. He stayed standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. He knew so well he had stopped looking at it, and stayed looking at New York, like someone looking at a city for the first time after years living in it. After a few minutes he sat on the sofa and stayed with his hands interlaced, looking at the space in front of him. There was a decision taking shape inside him, which was different from the decisions he usually made because it didn't come from analysis. It came from that other place that 20 years of trained rationality hadn't managed to eliminate completely. The place where the most correct things in his life had started before turning into strategy. The idea for the company had come from that place. The decision not to yield when everyone said to yield had come from that place. And now there was something coming from there again, with the same quality of certainty that didn't need justification because it was prior to any justification. He took his phone. He didn't call Patricia, who was the executive assistant of 7 years who resolved everything with a competence that had ceased to impress him by being so constant. He called Vera, who was the HR director of Mendonça Investments, and who was the type of professional Ralph had learned to call when the subject involved real people, not an organizational chart. "Vera," he said when she answered on the second ring, which was the number of rings she always took exactly, "I need you to check what would be necessary to create a human development consultant position here at the company. Focus on inclusive communication, accessibility, working with teams in high-pressure situations, salary compatible with ongoing training and the strategic function. I have a specific person in mind." Vera made the pause of someone who is taking notes and processing at the same time. "We've worked with that profile before in some initiatives. I'll pull together what we need to structure. Can I send you a draft on Monday?" "Monday is great." He hung up. He stayed looking at the phone in his hand for a second and then opened his contacts. Charlie, the waiter, had the number in his history from an order he had made once by call. He sent a short message asking for Chloe Vance's contact info. The answer arrived in less than 2 minutes, because Charlie was one of those professionals who answered customer messages quickly, regardless of the day of the week. Ralph looked at the number for a few seconds. He didn't send a message. It was Saturday. There was an order of things that needed to be respected, and the order said the professional conversation would happen after Vera gave the draft and after he had something concrete to offer, not before. He had learned that early. Never make an offer you aren't ready to honor. He saved the number and put the phone on the table. Sarah returned from her grandson's suite with a smile on her lips. She tried not to let show too much and failed. "He's sleeping," she said. "He asked to hear the sound of the rain before sleeping. I put on a video on the tablet with ambient sound." She paused. "He never used to sleep during the day before. He was the type of boy who needed to run until he was tired to manage to close his eyes." Ralph nodded his head. Sarah sat on the sofa beside her son, with that specific way of a mother who has something to say and is choosing the right moment. They stayed in silence for a few seconds, side by side, looking at the city through the window. "That young lady," Sarah said, with the tone of someone beginning an observation she knows is obvious but needs to be said out loud anyway, "didn't do anything special. That is what is frightening." Ralph looked at his mother. "She did exactly what any person could have done. She knelt down, touched, spoke. The simplest things in the world, and none of the specialists you brought did that. Not because they didn't know how, because they had protocol, they had technical distance, they had the training that says you can't create a bond in a certain way for a certain reason." Sarah paused. The girl didn't have that. She had her brother. Ralph stayed in silence. "You're going to call her to work with you," Sarah said. It also wasn't a question. "I'm already structuring the proposal." Sarah nodded her head in a movement that was approval and was also something more, that type of recognition mothers store for when their children make a decision that is correct not only by logic, but by what the person is. "And what are you going to say about her mother?" Ralph stayed with that. It was the part that didn't fit into any professional proposal structure. The fact that the woman who had changed the course of his life 14 years ago, with 9 words, had raised the person who had changed the course of his son on a Saturday in May. That there was an invisible line connecting that coffee of a desperate man to this lunch of a father with no way out, and that line had a name, had a face, had a brother who called on Sundays and an apron with a sauce stain. "I already said it," Ralph answered. Sarah turned to her son. How did she react? With dignity, like someone who recognizes her mother's heritage without needing more explanation. The mother stayed looking at her son for a moment, with that look of 68 years, and a whole life of learning to read what children don't say. Are you okay? It was a small question with a large reach. Ralph answered, with the honesty he reserved for the few contexts where it was possible, I'm starting to be. On the following Monday, Vera sent the draft before the time she had promised. On Tuesday, Ralph had the complete structure approved internally in a time that would have taken weeks in normal circumstances, but which took 2 days because Ralph had used that tone the team had learned to recognize as, it isn't an ego urgency, it's a real urgency. On Wednesday, he called the number Charlie had sent. Chloe answered on the 3rd ring, with a voice slightly out of breath from someone who was busy when the phone rang. Hello? Chloe, this is Ralph Mendonça, Leo's father. There was a small pause. Hi, how is he? That before anything else. Ralph noted it mentally. Better. Much better. Thank you for asking. A brief pause. I'd like to meet you if you have availability. I have a proposal to make to you, and I prefer to do it in person. The silence on the other side lasted longer than Ralph was accustomed to when he made invitations. Most people said yes before knowing what it was about. Chloe wasn't most people. What kind of proposal? The proposal that Martha Vance deserved to receive 14 years ago, and that I didn't know how to give because I didn't know who she was. He paused. And that her daughter deserves to receive today for who she herself is, not for her mother. Another pause. When Chloe spoke, her voice was different than before, a bit lower, like when something reaches near a part that is still sensitive. You can tell me where and when. Ralph scheduled for the following week, at a cafe in Chelsea that he chose because it wasn't the company headquarters and wasn't a place that said power before any word was spoken. He wanted her to enter that meeting without feeling small for any reason the environment might create. When he hung up, he stayed a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he went to Leo's room, who that afternoon was sitting on the bed with headphones on, listening to an audiobook story the therapist had recommended and that he had asked to hear without anyone needing to suggest it again. Ralph stayed standing at the door for a second. Leo turned his head in the direction of the sound of his father's footsteps. Dad. Hi, son. Do you know what petrichor is? Ralph smiled without his son being able to see. I do, the smell of rain on the earth. Chloe said that word. I've been thinking since Saturday. A pause. It's my favorite smell now. Ralph didn't answer immediately. He stayed at the door for another second, looking at his son who was back, who was thinking, who was storing favorite words and favorite smells, who was back in the world in a way no clinical report had predicted and no specialist had guaranteed, and that had happened because a waitress had knelt down and stayed. Chloe is coming here again, Ralph said. Soon. Leo turned his head back to the front, with that small and new smile that had appeared on Saturday, and that Ralph was learning to know all over again. I know, the boy said, with the absolute tranquility of someone certain of things adults were still trying to organize. I felt it. The cafe in Chelsea sat at one of those discreet addresses the city of New York reserves for conversations that need to happen out of the spotlight. No large sign, no line at the door, with white marble tables and windows looking out onto a street of plane trees, shedding yellow leaves in the May wind. Ralph had arrived 10 minutes early, as he did for any important meeting, and had stayed looking at the menu without reading it while he organized what he was going to say. Chloe arrived exactly on time. Not in an apron, not in a uniform. A navy blue blouse, black pants, hair loose falling over her shoulders in a way that looked neat, but not excessively so. She looked at the table Ralph had chosen with that quick look of someone who evaluates environments before entering, and walked to him with the direct step there was in everything she did. Ralph stood up when she came near, a gesture that wasn't corporate protocol, but came naturally. They placed their order, coffee for both. Chloe asked for the smallest on the list without looking at the price, with that gesture of someone who has the habit of not asking for what they won't be able to pay for, and hadn't yet recalibrated the gesture for the current context. How is Leo? She asked, before Ralph opened the proposal. He's talking, Ralph said. Every morning he stays with his headphones on listening to audiobooks and then wants to debate what he heard at breakfast. The therapist said she had never seen an evolution like this in this amount of time. A pause. He asked for you twice during the week. Chloe looked at the cup that had arrived. He's going to be okay. He already is. They stayed in silence for a second, the type of silence that is different from embarrassment, which is the silence of two people who have already seen each other in an important moment and no longer need to build terrain. "I want to make you a professional proposal," Ralph said. "But first I want it to be clear that it has two foundations, and neither of them is a favor. The first is the debt I have to your mother, which I never paid and could never pay, but which I recognize. The second and more important is what you demonstrated on Saturday, which has a name, has depth, and has real value for the company I direct." He paused. "I want you to hear me as a professional first. Your mother's story may be at the back of all this, but it cannot be the reason you decide. If you accept, I want you to accept because it makes sense for you, not out of gratitude for who I am, not out of sentimentality." Chloe looked at him. There was in that look a seriousness Ralph had learned to recognize as the sign she was processing for real, not performing listening. "Continue. Mendonça Investments has 320 employees in New York. In the last 3 years, turnover rates and leave for burnout have increased in a way I can't reverse just with process adjustment. I have an excellent HR director who diagnoses the problem but who tells me that a layer of human communication is missing that corporate protocols can't supply." He opened his hands slightly over the table. "What you did with Leo in 40 minutes is exactly that layer. It isn't isolated technique. It's a way of seeing the person before seeing the problem, of lowering yourself to the level of where they are instead of waiting for them to climb up to the protocol." Chloe was listening with that attention Ralph had seen in the restaurant, the attention that doesn't divide itself between hearing and thinking about what it will answer. "I don't have a corporate background," she said when he finished. "I know that. I've never worked in an environment like your company's. I don't know how to make performance spreadsheets. I don't know HR language. I don't have experience with people management in the formal sense." "I know that too. Then why me?" "Because performance spreadsheets I have people to make. Vera, my director, makes performance spreadsheets better than any consultancy I've ever hired. What Vera can't do is what you do. I don't hire technique. I hire what you are." He paused. "And what you are can be developed in a structure that gives you time, resources, and space to continue the speech pathology training you had to interrupt." That landed on the table between the two with a specific weight. Chloe stayed looking at the coffee cup for a moment. "You know, I interrupted the course for lack of money and not by choice," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was a check." "I know. And what are you offering exactly?" Ralph had brought the sheet Vera had prepared. He pushed it across the table. Chloe looked at the numbers. Ralph observed the moment her eyes processed the proposed salary, which was double what she had earned at any point in her life until then, and noted she didn't show the excessive enthusiasm most people showed. She stayed quiet with the sheet, rereading with attention. "Flexible hours to make it compatible with the course," he said. "Health insurance for you and for Lucas. Participation in leadership development meetings as an observer for the first 6 months to learn the structure before needing to operate within it. Partnership with Vera in developing a protocol that uses your approach with the teams." Chloe folded the sheet with care. "Until when can I think about it?" "As long as you need." She lifted her eyes. 1 week. "Deal." They drank their coffee. The conversation that came after was lighter, left the formal tracks and went to Leo, to what the boy had said the previous week about petrichor, to the oak leaves in the park Chloe had mentioned, and that she said in the next fortnight would be at the right point in the New York fall. Ralph listened and realized he was smiling in a work conversation, which was something he had stopped doing some time before he knew he had stopped. The week passed with the speed and slowness that weeks have in which one waits for something. Ralph didn't call. He respected the deadline with that discipline he had learned to apply in contexts where haste undoes what patience builds. On Thursday, exactly 7 days after the coffee, the phone vibrated in the middle of a meeting. Ralph excused himself, went out, and read the message from a number he had saved with the name Chloe V. The message said, "I accept, but on one condition." Ralph typed back, "What?" The answer took 2 minutes. When it arrived, Ralph stayed looking at it on the screen for a second longer than he had stayed looking at any professional message in recent years. The message said that when Leo comes to visit me at the office, you stay by his side the whole time. Not behind a meeting room window looking from afar. By his side. He needs you present, not you managing from a distance. Ralph stayed with that. It was a condition no consultant had ever put in any proposal he had received. It was a condition that had nothing to do with the job and everything to do with what mattered. He typed back, "Deal." And then, after a pause, he added, "Thank you." Chloe's answer came immediately. "No need to thank me. Take care of Leo. That is the work that matters." Ralph went back to the meeting. Patricia, who was in the room and had known him for 7 years, noticed something in his expression she didn't know how to name, but noted mentally as different from the usual. Ralph opened his laptop, looked at the numbers on the agenda, and realized he felt like ending the meeting quickly to call his son and tell him Chloe had accepted. It was a small and huge urge at the same time. It was the urge of a father who was learning, as he had promised his son in a restaurant in Greenwich Village, to ask better questions. Chloe's desk was on the 20th floor of the Mendonça Investments Tower, in a wing Vera had prepared with an attention Ralph had noticed and not commented on, but which told him something about how the director had interpreted the importance of that hire. It was a desk near the window, not the main window where the partners stayed, but a side window that looked out onto a street with trees, and that at certain angles of the day captured the afternoon light in a way that made the space more human than the rest of the floor. In the first few days, Chloe had arrived earlier than the agreed time and stayed mapping the environment with the attention of someone who doesn't enter a new place without first understanding how it breathes. She had greeted every person by name after learning them in the first conversation, had taken coffee in the break room with the analyst team instead of at her own place, had asked about each one's work with that specific curiosity people felt as real interest because it was real interest. In 2 days, she had the social map of the floor as detailed as Vera had after months. Not all had received her arrival with equal enthusiasm. There was, in a wing of the finance department, a group of senior analysts who had arrived at the company through the conventional route. MBA, internship in consultancy, years of hierarchy progression. The arrival of a young woman without a completed university degree for a position Vera had described in internal circulation as strategic human development consultant had provoked the type of noise corporations generate when the pattern is challenged. The noise wasn't loud. It was the whispered type that circulates in corridors between coffees and never reaches a formal meeting, because those who produce it know it wouldn't survive a formal meeting. Chloe knew the noise existed, not because anyone had said so, but because she had antennas for that type of thing she had developed in a very different environment from that one. That of the waitress who enters the dining room of an expensive restaurant and learns to read what people communicate before they open their mouths. There were faces that greeted her with their mouths while their eyes said something else. There were invitations to meetings that arrived at the minimum notice time, the type of invitation that includes without integrating. She had decided in the first few days not to respond to the noise with defense. She had decided to respond with work. In the second week, Vera called her for a meeting with the middle leadership team to present the pilot project the two had developed together. It was an active listening protocol for managers, built on the communication base Chloe had practiced her whole life with Lucas and now translated into organizational language with the help of Vera, who had the formal instruments Chloe didn't yet have. Chloe had prepared the presentation with the rigor of someone who knows they have one chance and doesn't want to waste it through haste. The meeting happened in a room with 12 managers and the gaze of Ralph, who had fulfilled the promise to be present and not managing from a distance. Chloe had presented for 40 minutes, without excess slides, without jargon that meant nothing, with that direct clarity of someone who talks about something they know by body before knowing by theory. She had given examples that didn't come from books. They came from a brother losing his vision in rural Pennsylvania, from an 8-year-old boy in a restaurant, from a mother who had learned that serving well was a way of caring. In the end, there was silence. And then one of the company's oldest managers, A woman named Fiona, who had arrived at the company 20 years earlier as an assistant and who had the reputation of not wasting approval, had said only, "When do we start?" The noise in the corridors didn't disappear completely after that, but it changed tone, it became lower, and Chloe had learned with her whole life of learning things in contexts that didn't give her ease, that a lower tone is progress enough to continue. The speech pathology course was resumed in the third week. Chloe went twice a week to the college in the afternoon, and Ralph had seen to it that the meetings needing her presence were scheduled in the windows that didn't collide. She had returned to the classroom with that specific feeling of someone resuming something interrupted by circumstances, and not by choice. A mixture of relief and a slight shame at having been away so long, which the professor had dismantled in a brief comment when Chloe had introduced herself back to the class. Knowledge doesn't age in your head while you're away. Sometimes it comes back more mature. It was an August afternoon when Ralph appeared at the door of Chloe's office with Leo at his side. It had been 3 months since the Saturday in the restaurant. Chloe had a report open on the computer and heard the steps in the corridor before seeing them. That slightly dragging step Ralph had when he wasn't in a hurry, combined with the smaller and more uncertain but increasingly confident step of the boy who had learned to orient himself by sound and touch. "I have a visitor," Ralph said, standing at the door. Chloe got up from the chair. Leo had stayed standing in the doorframe with his head slightly tilted, listening to the environment, mapping. It was a gesture she recognized, and that made her smile. "Leo." The boy smiled. It was a full smile, without any of the reticence of the first days after the accident. "Hi, Chloe. Dad said you were going to show me where he works." "I am. Where do you want to start?" "By the place where things are decided." Ralph looked at his son with an expression Chloe read as the mixture of pride and surprise parents have when their children say something more precise than they expected. "Why the place where things are decided?" Ralph asked. "Because you spend a lot of time here," Leo said, with that 8-year-old logic that was more direct than most adults manage to be. "So the place where things are decided must be important." Chloe looked at Ralph. He looked back. There was a quick communication there that had already developed in the 3 months of living together, the communication of two people who learn each other's non-verbal vocabulary before realizing they are learning it. Chloe guided Leo's hand through the textures of the 20th floor with that patience that didn't need instruction to appear, which was in her like muscle memory is in the body after years of practice. The carpet of the hallway, the cold metal of the handrail, the marble of the main reception that stayed colder than the carpet, even in the controlled temperature of the air conditioning. The glass of the main window that faced south and in the late afternoon stayed hot from the sun. Leo touched everything with that specific concentration of someone building a map that wasn't visual, but was equally detailed. He asked questions about the height of the building, which Chloe answered by counting from the ground up in blocks of 5 floors, about how many people worked there, which Ralph answered with a businessman's precision, about whether the rain made noise on the window up there the same way it did down there. That last question made Chloe stop for a second. "It's different," she said. "Up here the rain hits with more force because there's no building blocking the wind, so the noise is louder, more direct. It sounds like the rain is closer." "It's exactly that." Leo was quiet with that, and then he said, "I want to hear the rain from here once." Ralph, who had stayed beside his son the whole time as he had promised, not behind any meeting room window, said with a voice softer than the voice he used in most contexts of that building, "When it really rains, we'll come." The boy nodded like someone closing a deal, and then, with that ear that had been tuned by necessity and by weeks of listening, he turned his head in Chloe's direction and said, "You're wearing the same perfume from the restaurant." Chloe stayed still for a second. "It smells like rain," Leo said. "That smell, petrichor." And then Ralph understood that his son had carried that smell since the first day as an anchor, as the first good thing after everything that had been difficult, and that Chloe Vance had become, without ceremony and without protocol, the person who smelled like rain in his son's world. There was an emotion that rose without asking permission, and that he couldn't bury fast enough this time. He stayed with it, without turning his gaze to the window. He had learned in the last 3 months to stay with emotions instead of burying them. It was a slow and necessary learning, and it was happening. There was a notebook. Chloe had found it in a cardboard box Lucas had sent from Philadelphia by mail with a note taped to the lid. "Things of Mom's that were at my house. I thought you'd want to have them." The box had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, when Chloe was returning from the double shift she had stopped doing after entering the company, but which had appeared as a physical memory when she saw the box, the memory of what it was like to carry that specific exhaustion of days that ended inside the bus at dawn. She had opened the box that same night, in the small apartment in Brooklyn she had rented, when she came to New York, and which was beginning to have the appearance of a place inhabited by someone who was staying, with the plant in the window that had survived the first month, with the speech pathology books scattered on the living room table along with her work notebooks, with the photos of Lucas on the shelf and a small photo of her mother in a wooden frame she had bought at a craft fair. The box had a blouse she recognized immediately as her mother's smell before she recognized the color, which was dark green and which Martha Vance had worn on special dates with that simple elegance of someone who knows what they wear is part of what they communicate. There was a silver bracelet, a rosary, an envelope with old photos from when Chloe and Lucas were little, and that she had to put down on the table for a few minutes before continuing to open, because the photos reached her chest with that specific weight of time that doesn't return. And there was the notebook. It was a simple notebook with a black cover, the type one buys at a neighborhood stationery store for almost nothing. It had her mother's name written on the cover in the rounded handwriting Chloe had known since childhood. She had seen notebooks like that in other phases of her mother's life, notebooks where Martha Vance recorded things she considered important, recipes sometimes, observations about her children when they were little, thoughts that wouldn't fit into a conversation. She opened the notebook with that specific care of someone who knows they will find something that cannot be undone after being found. The first pages had recipes, sourdough bread with temperature specifications her mother had tested and refined over years, her grandmother's corn cake with a note in the margin, saying the flour measurement in the original recipe was wrong and that it was necessary to add 2 fingers more. Then came various observations, on dates scattered over several years, some with dates, others without. Her mother had noted things from work, conversations that marked her, observations about people who had passed in front of her and whom she had stored, because there was something in them that seemed too big to let go without a record. Chloe was reading slowly, with that type of reading that doesn't rush to the end because it knows the end means it's over, when she came to a page with a date written at the top. The date was from 14 years ago. Her mother's handwriting was as familiar as her voice, and what was written on that page made Chloe completely motionless. Her mother had written about a young man who had entered the restaurant on a weekday afternoon. She had described, with that precision of someone who observes people with genuine attention, his posture, his shoulders slightly curved from a load that wasn't physical, the way he looked at his cup of coffee after receiving it, like someone trying to find in the liquid an answer. Reason wasn't giving. She had written that there was something in that face she recognized, in the way one recognizes someone at the exact point of inflection between giving up and trying once more, and that she had said to him the only thing that seemed to be true, that he looked like someone who was going to go far. And then a few lines below in slightly different handwriting, like someone returning to a note after some time. He came back, years later, already different in his step, different in the way he enters any room. He asked for me. I learned through other waiters. He didn't manage to find me. But someone told me he had asked and left for the shift manager a tip that looked more like gratitude than calculation. I don't know if it was for me, but I like to think it was. And then, in a final line in smaller handwriting, almost as a note to herself, I hope he reached there. He looked like someone who reaches. Chloe stayed looking at those words for a time she didn't know how to measure. The apartment was quiet. The city was making its noise outside. The plant in the window moved slightly with the draft from the fan. There was something in those lines that was small and was immense at the same time, as things are that only reveal their size when we stop looking at them and start feeling the weight. The next morning she took the notebook to work. She hadn't planned to. She had left home with her bag with the notebook inside, as if the decision had been made while she slept and she was just fulfilling it. She reached the 20th floor before the scheduled time, placed the notebook on the desk and stayed looking at it for a few minutes. Then she got up, went to Ralph's office. He was standing by the window with a coffee in his hand and his phone in the other, which was the standard position of the first 20 minutes of the day when he read the news summaries and overnight reports before starting meetings. He lifted his eyes when she entered, with the expression of someone who recognizes that something different from normal is happening before knowing what. "Can it be now?" Chloe asked. Ralph put down the phone. "It can." She placed the notebook on the small conference table that stood in a corner of the room. She opened it to the right page, which she had marked with a piece of paper before leaving home. She pushed it gently toward Ralph. He approached. He read. Chloe stayed standing by the window while he read, looking at the city down there, which at that hour of the morning had dense traffic and the low sun hitting the windows of the neighboring buildings, creating reflections that moved like living things. She heard Ralph's silence changing quality as he read, the way the silence of someone reading any text is different from the silence of someone reading something that changes something inside. It took time. More time than the lines would need for someone who reads fast, which Ralph did. He was rereading, twice, maybe 3 times. When he lifted his eyes, there was in them something Chloe had seen only once before, in the restaurant, when Leo had said "Dad" for the first time in 23 days. That emotion that men who learn to bury emotion for decades cannot bury when it arrives from a place they weren't expecting. "She knew I had come back," Ralph said. "Yes. She kept it. She kept everything that mattered." They stayed in silence for a moment. From the corridor came the usual noise of the floor waking up, the coffee machine, conversations, keyboards. Ralph looked back at the notebook and placed the tips of his fingers on the page with a care that seemed disproportionate to the object and was exactly proportional to what the object represented. "I thought for years that that sentence had been a coincidence," he said. "A good-humored employee on a good day who said something that happened to arrive at the right time." A pause. "This notebook says it wasn't coincidence, that she saw something and decided to name it, that it was an intentional act by a person who believed the right words changed something. She believed that until the end," Chloe said. "It was what moved her." Ralph looked at her. "It's what moves you, too." Chloe didn't answer immediately, and when she did, it was with that direct honesty that was her mother's clearest heritage. "Yes, I think it is." There was a long and silent moment, and then Ralph said something he hadn't planned to say, which came out with the same naturalness with which the truest things come out. "Thank you for bringing this. You could have kept this for yourself." "I couldn't," Chloe said. "It was yours as much as mine. Maybe more." She took the notebook back with care. Before leaving, she stopped at the door and said, without turning, she would have liked to know he reached there. That he had reached indeed. Ralph stayed with that after she left. He stayed with the coffee that had cooled, the city that continued outside, and the complete certainty that there was a thread crossing 14 years of his life that he had never seen, but which had always been there, sewing together things that seemed separate into a single plot that needed enough time to reveal its own pattern. It rained in New York on a Wednesday in September, in the type of rain the city reserves for afternoons, when it decides to remember that something still exists beyond asphalt and concrete. Not the quick summer rain that lasts 20 minutes and goes away leaving the heat heavier. The long, dense rain, the kind that arrives before lunch and stays until the end of the afternoon, the kind that makes the noise that fills the windows like music when people are inside and have the privilege of staying looking at it from a warm place. Leo had woken up that morning before his father and had said with that child's certainty that doesn't explain where the knowledge comes from that it was going to rain. He had felt it in the air, he said, a different humidity, heavier. The caregiver who accompanied the boy in the mornings had stayed in silence for a second and then looked at the window, which had a grayish sky she had noticed but hadn't processed yet. It was the 3rd time that month that Leo had anticipated rain with that meteorologist's precision. Ralph had reached the office knowing it was a day to rain because his son had warned him. He had also warned Chloe by message before leaving, with a brevity that had become the tone of communications between the two after months. "He knows it's going to rain today. I think we should fulfill the promise." The answer had arrived while he was in the elevator. "He's going to love it. Let me know when you arrive." The rain started at 2 in the afternoon, with that gradual crescendo of someone settling in to stay. Ralph picked up his son from school at 3, a little before the time. With the permission granted by the teacher who had heard the father's explanation, with an expression that was simultaneously confusion and conviction that there was something important happening. She didn't need to fully understand to respect. On the way to the building, inside the car, the noise of the rain on the vehicle's metal roof had made Leo turn his head up, with that tuned ear of someone cataloguing a new sound in their own archive. He stayed like that for a moment. Then he said, "It's different." "What?" "The rain here inside the car. It's as if it's all around, on all sides, but it doesn't reach you." Ralph had driven the last blocks in a silence that was one of those full silences, the ones worth more than most conversations. Chloe was at the building entrance when they arrived, with her ID badge around her neck and an umbrella she hadn't opened because she was waiting in the sidewalk cover. Leo heard her steps before she spoke, and the smile appeared on the boy's face, with that lead time Ralph had learned to recognize as the sign his son had located something that mattered. "You promised," Leo said. "I promised," Chloe said. The three of them went up. In the elevator, Leo stayed holding his father's hand, as he had stayed since that Saturday in the restaurant, with that naturalness of someone who resumed a habit that should never have been interrupted. The elevator had a slight hum that Leo had once described as the sound of a thing thinking, which was an image Ralph had found precise enough to use in a team meeting 2 days later as an example of how the best descriptions come from those who pay different attention. The 20th floor was calmer than usual for that hour, with part of the team in an external meeting and another part focused on weekend deliveries. Chloe walked down the corridor with Leo at her side, guiding him lightly by the arm, and Ralph on the other side fulfilling the promise he had made by message, and before that by word in a cafe in Chelsea. Present at the side, not managing from a distance. They reached the large window that faced south, the floor's main window, that in the afternoon stayed hot from the sun but now was cold and vibrating slightly with the pressure of the rain on the outside. Leo placed his hand on the glass before anyone suggested it. He stayed still, feeling. "It's different from the car," he said, firmer, as if the rain were hitting with more force because there's nothing in the way. "Up here the wind doesn't find the other buildings," Chloe said, positioning herself beside him with that exact proximity of someone who learned to occupy the correct space beside someone who orients by touch and sound. "Here it comes direct. It sounds like the rain is coming just for us." Ralph stayed a step behind the two. It was a position he had chosen consciously, not of absence but of deliberate space that gave his son and that woman the scene they needed to have. He stayed looking at the two with their backs to him, facing the window, Leo with his hand on the glass and his head slightly tilted for the sound, Chloe beside him with that presence that didn't need to be big to be complete. Chloe began to describe the city seen from above, not as a tourist guide describes, not with the informative efficiency of someone transmitting data, in the way she did everything, with the vocabulary of textures, sounds, temperatures. The city as a tactile map built of words, the lower buildings that looked like shoulders curved on a cold day, the streets that from above looked like rivers that didn't have water but had the continuous movement of living things, the dark green of the trees in Central Park, receiving rain that from the 20th floor looked like a glow that pulsed. Leo heard everything with that attention that had been tuned by the accident and deepened by months of practicing a new way of understanding the world. He asked questions about the distance between their building and the tallest building Chloe described on the left, about the specific sound of the horns down there, which was weaker but more continuous than when he heard from the sidewalk, about whether the rain left marks on the glass that could be seen from inside. "Yes," Chloe said, "it leaves lines. The water runs down the glass in different ways depending on how the wind is pushing. Sometimes in a straight line, sometimes in curves, sometimes several lines join into one. Like small rivers on the glass. Exactly that." Leo stayed quiet for a moment, with his hand still on the glass, feeling the vibration of the rain on the outside transmitted by the glass to his fingers. And then he asked, with that voice that had become firm and full over the months, "Why do you describe things I can't see?" It was the question Chloe had answered once before, weeks ago, when the boy had asked the same question in a different context. But there was something in the way it was asked this time that was deeper, that came from a more mature place, that was asking not for the technical answer, but for the true answer. Chloe answered, "Because when I describe them to you, you see them in another way." Leo stayed in silence for a second. Then, very softly, he said, "And that other way is good. It's the best there is." Ralph stayed with that in his chest for a long moment. He stayed with the image of the two with their backs to him, facing the window that had the rain on the outside and the city on the outside and everything that was big and noisy and difficult on the outside, and the two of them there inside exchanging those words with the calm of someone who already knows they have what they need to cross anything big and noisy and difficult. He took his phone. He took the photo without either of them noticing. It wasn't a posed photo, it wasn't a thought-out photo. It was the photo of the exact moment as it was, with the afternoon light filtered by the rain and the two outlines from behind and the blurred city behind the glass. It was imperfect, and it was the truest thing the phone had captured in years. When he returned home that night, Ralph stayed sitting in the living room for a time after Leo went to sleep. He opened the phone gallery. He looked at the photo. He stayed looking for a time he didn't know how to measure, and then he went to the settings and changed the wallpaper, which had been for years the professional photo in a suit at some European conference that the press officer had chosen because that corporate identity communication had arrived. He put the photo of the two in front of the window. The following week, during a board meeting, partner Robert Miller had looked at Ralph's phone, which was on the table, and asked who the people in the photo were. Ralph had looked at the phone and answered only, "It's what matters." Robert had stayed with that answer for a second and then returned to the agenda. Later, leaving the meeting, he had asked Patricia if she knew what had happened to Ralph in recent months, because there was something different in the man, and it was different for the better, but he couldn't name it, him. Patricia had answered that it was a long story and that someday she would tell it, but that the summary was that a boy had learned to hear the world in another way and that had taught the father to see his own. The months that came after had the texture of things that grow slowly and in a real way. Chloe had finished the college semester with approval in all subjects and with a module completion project that the professor had asked to use as a reference for the following classes. The active listening protocol she and Vera had developed had been applied in 3 departments of the company, with results that appeared in the indicators before anyone expected. Not as magic, but as a logical consequence of what happens when people feel seen before they feel evaluated. Leo had returned to school full-time at an institute in Brooklyn that worked with children with visual impairment, where he had found classmates who understood by body what he was learning to understand, and where there was a teacher who described the subjects in a way that made the boy arrive home full of questions that lasted the whole dinner. He had filled a new notebook of notes, not of planes this time, but of sounds, a collection of descriptions written with the help of the caregiver, cataloguing each sound he had learned to recognize and what each one meant. The notebook had a title on the cover, written in the irregular handwriting of an 8-year-old boy, "The Way the World Makes Noise." And on an October afternoon, when the oak trees in the park near the restaurant in Greenwich Village had finally let go of the leaves Chloe had promised, Ralph took his son there on a Saturday morning. Chloe was waiting on the corner in a light coat, and her hair loose and the expression of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why it mattered. The 3 of them went to the interior of the park, where the dry leaves covered the ground in yellow and ochre. Ralph stayed 2 steps behind, as he had learned to do. Chloe guided the boy to the middle of the leaves and then said only, "Now." Leo took the step. The sound was exactly what she had promised, the sound of dry leaves in the fall, crunchy, clear, real. The boy took another step, then another. Then he stopped in the middle of the leaves with his feet planted and his head lifted and stayed listening to his own weight on that yellow carpet that smelled of damp earth and time passing. Then he said, to no one in specific, and to both at the same time, "It's one of the best things in the world." And it was. A waitress with a stained apron had done in 40 minutes what no paid specialist had managed in 23 days. Not with special technique, not with an imported method, just because she had looked at a boy and decided without thinking much that he deserved someone to kneel down to his level and tell him how dry leaves sound in the fall. Just because she had grown up beside a brother who lost his vision slowly and had learned since childhood that the most important way to be near someone is to learn to speak the language of the world where that person lives. And because some people pass through others' lives like a key passes through a lock, quick, without ceremony. But what was stuck opens. And what opens doesn't go back to closing in the same way. It stays different, looser, more ready for what comes, like a door that finally found the right angle. Dear listener, if the story of Ralph, Leo, and Chloe touched your heart, then you know exactly what we mean when we say some stories arrive at the right time, like those 9 words a waitress said to a desperate young man in a New York cafe. We've prepared a special list of stories with the same heart as this one, stories of ordinary people who change the course of others with gestures that don't fit into any protocol. You can find that list right here on the side. Just click. If this narrative stayed with you, if you felt the smell of rain at some point while listening, leave your like because it tells us we're on the right path. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the perfect moment for it, because tomorrow there's another story waiting for you. And it was made thinking of someone exactly like you. We'll meet in the comments. Tell us, who was the Chloe of your life? Who was the person who appeared at the moment you most needed and said the thing that changed everything? We want to read. We are here. Until the next story. The end.